Also, to let all of the participants know, this is already being recorded, and to introduce some of our hosts and panelists that are here for this event, What Does Abolition Look Like? We have Maya Schenwar, who is the editor-in-chief of Truthout. She's the co-author with Victoria Law, who is also here, of Prison by Any Other Name, as well as the author of Lockdown, Locked Out, and the co-editor of the anthology of Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect? And she lives in Chicago. Victoria Law is a freelance journalist and co-author with Maya Schweiner of Prison by Any Other Name, as well as the author of Resistance Behind Bars and co-editor of Don't Leave Your Friends Behind. She is also a co-founder of NYC Books Through Bars and lives in New York. We're also joined with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, professor of geography at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Ruthie has co-founded many grassroots organizations, including California Moratorium Project, Critical Resistance, and the Central California Environmental Justice Network. Follow her to recent interviews on abolition and racial capitalism. And I'm gonna go ahead and add that into the chat as well. So Maya or Victoria, would you like to take it away?
Yes. All right. Since this is my hometown and my home bookstore, I'm going to start. Thanks everyone for coming. We all love Bluestockings. We would love it even more if we had been able to have this event in person, but alas, here we are. Thanks again for spending Saturday afternoon or Saturday night or Sunday morning at 4 a.m. in Australia, for those of you tuning in from there with us. Again, we're in New York City, or we're being hosted by my home bookstore in New York City. And I just wanted to thank Bluestockings for having us. For me, it's really special to have our book launch here because it is my home bookstore. It saw my daughter go from being a baby in a stroller to a toddler who disrupted many an event there, to a child who read all of the children's books and then complained that there weren't more, to a young adult who now reads lots of books. It's where I did the book launch for my first book, Resistance Behind Bars, in 2009. And it has been the host bookstore for Books Through Bars New York City, which I co-founded since the early 2000s. And so I am super thrilled, and we are super thrilled to have our book launch here, well, in their virtual bookstore. And I want to encourage all of our viewers to support your local radical bookstores. Because remember, even if you can get your books cheaper off Amazon and all these other sites, they are certainly not going to be hosting awesome abolitionist events like this, ever. Before we get started, I also want to thank the groups that co-sponsored this event and encourage people to check out their work. So in addition to Bluestockings hosting, Books Through Bars New York City is one of our co-sponsors. They send free books to people in prison nationwide. Critical Resistance New York City also generously agreed to co-sponsor, and they have been doing a lot of work against the prison industrial complex and towards a world in which prisons are no longer necessary. The Independent free paper for free minds. I was going to go pick up a copy of the paper and then I just never left my house. So, but you can look them up online, or if you live in New York City, go find an independent red newspaper box and get one. And Survived and Punished New York, which supports criminalized survivors of gendered violence who are in prison or facing criminal charges for acts of survival. Thank you as well to our ASL interpreters, Brandon Kazan-Maddox, who is currently on your screen, and Crystal Butler, who will be switching off with Brandon, as well as Renata Reed and All County Captions for making this event accessible. Now I'm going to hand it to Maya to take it away.
Thanks so much, Vicki, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. So exciting. Our book is launching after 4 years of working on it. Congratulations, Vicki.
Congratulations, Maya.
I just want to tell people real quick that if a 2-year-old randomly shows up on the screen, that's because I have a 2-year-old. It's not, you know. So we'll work with it if it happens. But for now, I think we're safe.
Can I jump
So,
in for a second, Maya? Because
oh
I
yeah,
do this during our in-person events, and it's harder to do during our virtual events. But remember that when we hear kid noises or see small people jumping onto video screens, we need to take this as a sign of our movement growing. And so we should applaud and encourage their participation.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully their participation will not involve closing my computer, as it has in the past on Zoom webinars. So yeah, this book that Vicki and I wrote, Prison by Any Other Name, which officially comes out on Tuesday, it looks at the way that some popular reforms to prison and policing are actually expanding prison into homes and communities. So we share the stories of people who are confined by electronic monitoring, house arrest, lockdown drug treatment centers, psychiatric hospitals, and also coercive outpatient treatments, sex offense registries, sex worker rescue programs, lockdown mother-baby facilities, and a whole bunch of other so-called alternatives. We also look at how police reforms, including community policing and data-driven policing, that type of thing, have resulted in more incarceration and more targeting of Black and Indigenous and other people of color communities. And we talk about how these supposedly fresh new reform ideas didn't come from nowhere. They're rooted in white supremacy. They're rooted in colonialism. They're rooted in ableism and capitalism and patriarchy. And we also discuss how prison and policing extend into all kinds of other institutions like the so-called child welfare system, which splits families apart violently every day, particularly Black and Indigenous families. In the book, we also look at what we do want. What does an abolitionist society look like? A society that rejects prison and policing in all of their forms. So that's part of what we're going to be getting into today. This question of what can abolition actually look like? And relatedly, what does ending racial capitalism look like? What does liberation look like? And I can't really think of a better person to be joining us for that conversation. We're so excited. We're going to be chatting with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who was the first person that we interviewed when we started researching this book 4 years ago, which is so weird. And then we interviewed Miriam Kaba not long after that. And those two interviews really grounded our focus for the book. And in our interview with Ruthie, we talked for a long, long time. Ruthie was very gracious, particularly since my cat was meowing into the phone half the time and sounded exactly like a baby elephant on the recording that Vicki and I listened to later. So that must have been really annoying. But that interview planted the seeds for some of the threads that we pursued in our book as we put it together over the past 4 years. And so it means a lot that we get to have this conversation with Ruthie today. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Ruthie.
All right, well, thank you, Maya, Vicki, all of my comrades who are part of Bluestocking, to our wonderful interpreters, to the captioner, to everybody. Thank you for being here today, and everyone who has come to listen to our conversation. And I want to second or third or fourth the enthusiasm already expressed by many people about how we will feel when Maya's 2-year-old pops into the picture. And the way I always put it is this: if you think you are revolutionary and you can't be in a room with children, you've come to the wrong revolution. Full stop. I have no children, so I am not a special pleader for my own case. I'm delighted to launch our launch and talk a little bit about how I read the work that Vicki and Maya put together in the 4 years since we talked. I can't believe it's been 4 years. Feels like yesterday, and it also feels like 2 decades ago. And then perhaps I'll raise some questions that will get us going in our general discussion. But one of the things that I think about all the time, and we talked about for a lot of the time with the cat 4 years ago, is the problem with having a general view of how the world works and then bringing that view down to the ground so we can see it working. And yet bringing it down to the ground so we can see it working without feeling debilitated or demoralized by how it works. So what abolition brings to our political agenda is thinking not just about all of the terrible things in the world, which we could spend 1 million hours talking about, but rather how to take what has for many people become a culture of complaint and turn it into the kind of perception and analysis of what people can and already do on the ground to make their lives better and better and better. So one of the great things that Vicki and Maya have done with their book is to give us so much detail about each case that we can see in the detail not only how all-encompassing the constantly expanding prison industrial complex is, but also get clues about where we can cut into it, where we can see little chinks of weakness or big holes through which we can move and do other things. Now, if we think about the people who are the organizations that are co-sponsors of today's event, we already know that people are doing all of this work. Vicki described the kinds of things that organizations do simply by naming them: Survived and Punished, Books Through Bars, and so on. So we already see on the ground how what might appear to be an all-encompassing system is one that is so riddled with contradictions that there's always some way to open it up. One other thing I thought I'd say in kind of introductory praise, and I have plenty more praise that I can return to, is that something that Vicki and Maya have done with this book models what people can do, whatever project they're taking on. And that is, Vicki and Maya, because of who they talk to, and I don't mean just me and Mariam, but all of the people they've talked to and all of the work that they've done and all of the thinking and wondering that they have done as remarkable journalists, researchers, activists, and revolutionaries, is to use a theory of abolition to guide them through the process of analyzing and sorting and organizing the stories. So we can see in the pattern of the book how people who maybe haven't yet thought about doing abolition work or who are doing one kind of abolition work, let us say, to stop the destruction of families by the child welfare system, can see how that connects to something else, something that might seem wholly other to that, like sex registry, for example. We can see the connections in this book, and they're not belabored, they're there. Just as in the life that we're living, including in lockdown under COVID, we can see connections if we've got the theoretical ability to look. And that's all abolition is. It's a theory of life, it's a theory of change, It's a vision, it's not a blueprint, it's a vision. And the vision is to look at how people make lives and figure out how we can make them stronger, better, safer, more secure. We are constantly learning by doing things and doing things in order to learn. This is something else that becomes extremely apparent as you read through the detailed chapters of this book. And I've emphasized the detail because it's so impressive. You will not wonder, what is it like to be captured in your home, in your household, in your community, in the entire scope of your life by this insatiable system that sucks resources, money resources, talent, and time. The one resource we cannot renew sucks money and time from individuals, households, and communities. And that then inspires us to think about what we can do to undo that. So thank you for having me here as part of the launch, and I look forward to our conversation.
Wow, thank you for that, Ruthie. I think we can just end the event here because that was a rave review. Kidding. So I have a few questions, and I thought maybe we could start in a place that I think helped give us some initial grounding for the book, even though we didn't directly take on this exact question in the text of it. So in our initial interview, Ruthie, you talked about how over the past few decades, the US has organized itself around a rising notion that the only legitimate purpose of the state is defense, both foreign and domestic. And now I'm thinking about how the US spends half its discretionary budget on the military, $732 billion. And then, of course, in this country, domestically, we can see how this principle of defense manifests in policing and prison and all of the forms of surveillance and confinement that Vicki and I discuss in our book. So this is a question for all of us, but maybe we can start first with you, Ruthie. What are some of the ways that this overwhelming focus on defense is playing out right now, and how does it relate to the prison industrial complex, how it's expanding and extending itself in so many ways?
That's a great question. And I also want to say as an aside that I look forward to the time when we will not be unmuting ourselves in order to talk. Very much. So what can I say? In broad strokes, what has happened in the United States and in many parts of the world, but not the same way everywhere, is that the reorganization of racial capitalism, which is all of it, not just some of it, every single aspect of all of capitalism through all of history has always been racial. The reorganization of racial capitalism has produced what I call organized abandonment. Organized abandonment is the abandonment of the capacity of people in urban and rural places to make livings and make lives. And it affects individuals, households, communities, entire regions, entire countries of the world. So just to give one example to make what I'm talking about concrete, imagine there was a factory in a town. The town could be New York or Chicago or Pittsburgh or a small place. And the factory produced the possibility for livelihood for the people who worked there and for the community. And the circulation of money in the community kept the community all right. I'm not saying it was utopia, I'm saying that's how it was organized, with all of the hierarchies and inequalities that we can all discuss. Well, when the owner of the factory decided to leave that location because the workers were too well organized and their unions were making too big demands on profits, or to leave that community because agitation for environmental protection had raised demands that the factory change the manner of producing whatever the good was in order to reduce pollution, leave water clean and so forth, or for some other reason. The factory owner, whether it's a huge capitalist or some relatively small owner, decided to leave. That is part of organized abandonment, the capitalist deciding to leave. At the same time, the various levels of government of that place, the local state, the municipality, the regional county, the state, and the federal state, all, rather than getting in the way of that livelihood leaving, instead backed away, lifted any barrier to keeping them from leaving, and then what was left in the wake? What was left in the wake were people with needs, without income, without adequate tax basis for schools, for health, and so forth. So this is one very straightforward example, but you can think about hospitals, you can think about public education, you can think about all different aspects of the institutions through which we live our lives. The institutions of health, the institutions of public education, the institutions of capitalism, including firms and finance capital and so forth, have all worked together to deepen inequality across time and between people and between places. So all of that and more adds up to what I call organized abandonment. It's organized. It's not like overnight, it's not random. It's very, very, very well thought through. What has come in to take the role of shaping the effects of organized abandonment? Is it an expanded and deepened and more elaborated welfare state, guaranteeing food, housing, healthcare, protection, and quality education to everybody? No. Those things are not what filled the void. Rather, because state and capital work together on the abandonment in the first place, we know that state and capital, in its various configurations, are not, were not, and will not, unless we make it happen, will not be devoted to ensuring that the lives of individuals, households, and communities flourish and develop. Rather, what's happened is that the state, having lost whatever little legitimacy it had for the very weak welfare state that ever came into being in the United States between the Great Depression of the 1930s and the early 1970s, has replaced those weak welfare state structures, never equally available to everyone to start with more and more punitive policing, which is to say the forces of organized violence. That is what has happened. So in that context, we see prison rising, we see police budgets rising, military rising, even if the size of the standing armed forces has gone down. And we see most poignantly and frighteningly, but also importantly, that within the institutions designed for social well-being, like schools, like hospitals, like aid to families with dependent children or temporary assistance for needy families, and so forth. We see within those institutions and agencies more and more imitation of policing functions, as you demonstrate in your book. In order for somebody to qualify for housing, they first must be policed. In order for somebody to have housing, they will be perpetually policed. For people to have adequate and appropriate education, the policing function comes in. And what we see is within, for example, departments of education, growing and growing and growing and growing, chunks of those departments devoted to policing. I mean, I'll give you the most absurd example. The United States Department of Education, the one that Betsy DeVos runs now, has a SWAT team. It has a SWAT team. Now, why would it have a SWAT team? Other than they, at some point, decided that they could make a plea for whatever resources they would demand from the US Congress, if they could say, but what we're doing here is the legitimate thing, which is policing. And this, we see this over and over and over and over again. So this is the nexus that we're trying to break apart in the work that abolitionists do, to see how organized abandonment works in its various versions in different places. It's different rural, urban, it's different for different groupings of people, it's different for people based on their formal education and training, and then watch the ways that the forces of organized violence shape and diminish the possibility for people to organize to make their lives better.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Ruthie, and thank you for laying that out as to, you know, what that looks like. And we're seeing that organized abandonment, that organized abandonment play out all throughout this pandemic in the United States. Like we're seeing how that organized abandonment has meant less access to healthcare resources. We're seeing that mean less access to food. We're seeing like long lines for food banks and food shelters. We're seeing all of the effects of that organized abandonment we're seeing across the country. And we're seeing instead, as we've seen with the recent demands to defund the police, we're seeing that, these resources are again being put into these other institutions such as policing, such as prisons. During the height of COVID, we were seeing demands for people to be released from prisons, and instead the state hunkering down and saying, we're going to release these small amounts of people, if anyone at all. And at the same time, we're seeing doctors and nurses wearing garbage bags and reusing masks as police are bulked up in SWAT gear and military gear and with all sorts of fancy and expensive gadgets. So we've seen this over and over and over. And at the same time, we're also seeing these ideas of defense continue to play out and the state reshaping our demands so that, again, when we see police murdering Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Tony McDade and so many other people during this pandemic, we're seeing the state co-opt demands to defund the police by saying, no, actually what you want is neighborhood policing. Actually what you want is a neighborhood watch. Actually what you want is, fill in the blank with a reform that continues the status quo, if not puts more money into policing and ignores the fact that people are rebelling against this organized abandonment and saying, no, we actually want those resources shifted back to these support systems that you've decimated over the years. So when I walk down the street, you know, like, why do I see 10 police officers, you know, standing around outside on a corner to ostensibly police the police precinct? But then like 3 blocks away, there's literally a line around the block for the free food giveaway every Wednesday afternoon. Like, you know, like what are the resources that are happening there? And we can see how this plays out again and again and again as we look at how people are faring during the pandemic and what the priorities are in terms of state budgets, local budgets, and where our resources go.
Yeah, my head's like exploding with everything both of you said. I feel like we're so accustomed to defense being what's legitimate defense that we're able to believe that even things that are offered as humane alternatives are humane even when they're violent, if that makes sense, because both options are bad or all options fall into that category of defense. So Vicki and I talk a lot about how these kinder and gentler measures come in as so-called alternatives to incarceration, like electronic monitoring, like lockdown treatment centers. But these measures are actually still harsh and punitive and deadly. And part of this is because they're still operating according to this logic of defense instead of support. And I think just really quickly, I want to look at one of the linkages that I've been thinking about with US policy internationally, the example of economic sanctions. So in situations where we don't go into full-on war, very often the solution that everybody likes, including many Democrats and liberals, is economic sanctions. And they're presented as the merciful option, a tool of diplomacy. And meanwhile, people in Iran and Venezuela and North Korea and Palestine and Yemen are dying because of harsh US sanctions and embargoes. They can't get basic food and medical supplies during a pandemic. So many people can't access just the most basic medical necessities, but sanctions are the kind and merciful option because the other option is just expressly killing people, you know, but both options are weapons. And I think so much of what we're talking about, we're looking at options that are all weapons. And we can see how that connects with what we see here, where so often prison reform means substituting one cage with another kind of cage. When we interviewed Miriam, she talked about how many reforms are about putting people somewhere else, she called it, instead of ending criminalization. So you're still putting this label of criminal on people that will brand them for life very often, but maybe sometimes instead of confining them in a prison, you're confining them in a hospital or at home or in a so-called recovery home. Putting people somewhere that they can't get out of is in part, I think, about a sense of defending society, whatever that means. This idea that people who are put in this category of criminal must be kept away. And when Vicki and I talk about how some of these expansions of the prison industrial complex took place, we look at how highly publicized acts of violence are used as an excuse. Like, these measures are portrayed as a defense against these acts of violence that have already taken place. So when there are headline grabbing occurrences of sexual violence, particularly against white children and women, we see more stringent sex offense laws, including the growth of sex offender registries in the 1990s. Erica Miners writes about this, and we interviewed her as well. about how these harsh laws are actually named after some of these child victims, like Megan's Law, Adam Walsh Act, Jacob Wetterling Act, as if the way to defend against horrifying assaults and murders of children posthumously is to impose these draconian mass punishments. So now we have 900,000 people on registries with their housing and their lives and their relationships severely restricted and punished, with absolutely no evidence that those registries prevent any kind of violence. But somehow those registries are seen to be defending us. And we see the same thing, not the same thing, but a parallel thing happening in terms of how school policing expands in the wake of a high-profile school shooting like Parkland. Like, that's the solution. And in the realm of child protective services, when there are really highly publicized instances of child abuse, like what happened with Jerry Sandusky, then the country kicks in to defense mode even further in that department, just ramping up these violent laws around mandated reporting. So in a lot of states since the Sandusky thing a few years ago, everyone has become a mandated reporter. So you're responsible for policing the parenting of your neighbors and your friends and family. So I think all of these are defense moves. They're waging war, like waging ineffective war. And the logic is that if the policies are harsh and punitive, if they hurt people, then they must be good and effective. Even though, as we see from all the research, what we've done, but the vast body of research that came before us, they're not doing anything to actually reduce violence, of course, and certainly not providing support.
Indeed. I started to talk and then realized I was on mute and nobody could hear me. So, so connecting with this focus of resources on defense, we are now tumbling towards a full-scale economic depression. So how do we approach that as abolitionists? And how, like, we're seeing a rise in budget activism at this time. How do we approach this sliding into depression as abolitionists and working around budget activism? And what does it mean for our work to dismantle the prison industrial complex? Do you want to start, Ruthie?
Sure. It means everything, which is to say, dismantling the prison industrial complex means undoing all of the things that we've been talking about since we started our afternoon together. It means that instead of thinking of a faster, surer, longer punishment after a harm has happened, to figure out in as many ways as we can what sorts of conditions for everyday life for ordinary people minimize the chance of harm happening in the first place. This indeed is what Insight Women of Color Against Violence came into being to address almost 20 years ago. No, 20 years ago, huh? It has been 20. And that is that many women of color who had been working in the anti-violence movement for a very long time, from the 80s forward, had for a while embraced the idea of what came to be known as carceral feminism. And that idea suggested that if people who are vulnerable to interpersonal and domestic violence could turn to the police sooner, faster, better, and get their abusers, those who harm them, and normatively, many of the people thought of this as a movement against violence against women, that the police then stepping in sooner was somehow going to create at the domestic level peace. And what people like Beth Ritchie and Andrea Smith and all of the other people who started Insight Women of Color Against Violence despaired of by the end of the 1990s was carceral feminism was not doing anything other than increasing the size and the scope of the prison industrial complex. It was not, most importantly, reducing the incidence of violence against women of color. So they started Insight to, as it were, I think I'll use Andy Smith's words, to pivot and take a new look and start again. They asked themselves, what can we do? What have people done in their communities, in their households, to interrupt violence before it happens, rather than to have swifter, surer, harsher punishment after it happens? Of course, part of what what Insight did was to make note of, then as well as now, that very often when there is an incident in a household, if the police come, they will arrest somebody. And it is as often the person who is called with the complaint as the person who may have lifted their hand or some weapon against them. So that is a particularly clear example of what undoing the prison industrial complex demands. That we look very hard at harm, like straight in its face, and think about what we can do as human beings together in the world to make the world that we would prefer to live in, and not use the forces of organized violence to punish after the fact terrible things happening. But I want to take this a little bit further, if I may. Can I talk a little bit longer? Yeah? Okay. I want to take this a little bit further and pick up the point that Maya was making about humanitarian war. And that one of the synergies between the US military and US policing over the past 40 years or more has been they mirror each other in proposing that certain kinds of application of organized violence are not actually violence because they're humanitarian. So Maya gave the example of embargoes. Well, for an embargo to work, somebody has to be enforcing that. And the enforcement is only carried out through the practices of organized violence, and the effects of embargo are always violent, by definition. Well, similarly, in urban and rural parts of the United States and elsewhere, the movement back and forth between a kind of military occupation form of policing, which people are seeing everywhere now, and then the kinder, gentler, softer community policing, which has been rolled out over and over again, decade in and decade out, it always comes to the same thing. And that is that with the forces of organized violence present in the community, being the primary force expected to produce social peace, means that peace is only going to be understood in terms of conflict rather than its resolution. In terms of cooperating with police against neighbors and people in the community instead of resolving conflict. It became a very common thing in the 80s and 90s. In many households, many people, these are relatives as well as people I organized with and so on and so forth, that parents scolding their children would say, without meaning it, but they would say it. Don't make me call the popo, right? Now, it's funny, but it's not funny. That artifact tells us a lot about how people's imaginations concerning what children would respond to, what kinds of inducements, enticements, or threats parents can rightly use, and so forth, had turned everything into there's police and there's everything else. And as a result of the things that have happened in the United States over the last 40 years, I can tell you this. I can tell you first that 1/2 of the labor force, of the entire labor force, at least half, so 80 million people minimum, have some disqualifying arrest or conviction record, whether or not they were ever locked up or put under home arrest, that keeps them from being able to seek and get the kinds of jobs that modestly educated people in the prime of life do in the United States of America, making, moving, growing, and caring for things and other people. And this enormity is something that was produced and reproduced over time by those forces that I discussed early on, organized abandonment and organized violence, that these things produced half the workforce having some kind of disqualifying arrest or conviction record. And I just want to say that Congressman John Lewis passed away in the last day. And you know, he was a congressman, he was also a criminal. And some people listening will say, oh, don't say that. He was a criminal. Like every criminal, he had been criminalized through the conscious decision of the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, who decided that instead of letting the Ku Klux Klan run the Freedom Riders out of town, he would turn it over to the police in 1961. And he did that. He did that because at that time, Mississippi was going through a huge political economic transformation. And what the state of Mississippi wanted to secure were federal contracts for military industrial development and manufacturing, whether military industrial or not, in a state that would suppress unions and therefore increase the possibility of profit for the owners of the firms. That's why they used the police. And Ross Barnett bragged about sending the Freedom Riders to Parchman Farm and locking them up. And that moment and this moment are a continuum.
Yeah. I think that in a lot of these systems that we're talking about, like you mentioned, Ruthie, this idea of being able to see outside the police starts to get really challenging, you know, and I don't know, the parenting example you brought up, like for me, just a struggle every day to think about like how I'm actually perpetuating policing in my role as a parent. And actually yesterday, for the first time, Kai asked me, was it yesterday or the day before? He asked me, what does police means? And I was like, oh God, how do I even explain that? Like, how do I, you know, explain that to someone who just learned how to talk? Because it's so large and so all-encompassing. And I think, so a couple things popped up for me. One, this question of imagination. So practically every organizer that we interviewed, I think, talked about imagination being one of the stumbling blocks for this very reason, because all of these systems and services and structures that tell us they're humanitarian are actually forms of policing or enact policing in various ways. So a lot of people that we spoke with said this thing about like, okay, we have to push ourselves to imagine, which, you know, I had heard in various contexts before. And of course, we also know people are doing abolition every day already. But it really hit home when we were just starting to work on our book, and this op-ed popped up in The Week, this mainstream news magazine, and it was called Abolish Prison. And I was like, what? You know, and this wasn't this moment, this was 4.5 years ago. And it was saying that we should get rid of prison. But the author was actually calling for long sentence to be spent in electronic shackles, you know, one of the things we discussed, because he said it would be real punishment. He said people in prison actually had it too easy, and that someone should actually be spending a longer period of time being punished, working. And he didn't leave it there. He said this should involve working a minimum wage job and then having your wages garnished. And meanwhile, being trapped in your home with nothing else to do, taking away your TV and internet. And of course, this would primarily affect people who are living in poverty. And so this is called Abolish Prisons. And so we're like, okay, talk about, you know, limited imagination, but also the goal is the same, right? You're not shifting the goal at all with a situation like that. And obviously that's extreme, but it does demonstrate a lot of what's happening right now in terms of the way reforms are carried out in the name of, you know, being more humane, but really deepening levels of punishment and deepening poverty. One of Vicky, your question about thinking about all these goals in the context of economic depression and thinking about them in the context of budgets, I think now really is a great time to be calling for an end to spending on death-making systems. Obviously, money-related arguments are not the only ones, but I think we can look at the fact that we're operating on this logic of scarcity right now, but why? If resources are scarce, why does the US have 800 military bases on every continent except Antarctica? If resources are so scarce, why do we have cities like Chicago where we spend about 40% of our general operating budget on police, simply to have police unleash brutal violence where they beat and tear gas and incarcerated so many protesters just last night, you know, in Chicago? And I think if resources are so scarce, if we're thinking of it in that mindset, why are we throwing so many into entrapping more than 2.2 million people in torture chambers, otherwise known as prisons, and then over 3.5 million people on probation, and the list goes on? And we hear a lot about how budgets are statements of priorities, not only in terms of the line items, I think, but also in terms of life and death. Like, this is what those in power care about. And one of the many, many reasons that defund police is such a powerful call right now is because we're being told by people in power that even the most basic tools for survival are unfundable in the face of a pandemic. Things like unemployment extensions, healthcare, adequate COVID testing, and really the means to support people while doing what's necessary to protect as many lives as possible. We're told that that's impossible. And I think that more and more people are asking why. And organizers are calling us to realize that we're pouring our resources into murder, police, prison, surveillance, war, militarism. And I think I want to mention, as we think about this budget question, some of the reforms that Vicki and I discuss in the book are promoted as cost-saving measures. And in some cases, they do actually cut costs for local governments because they foist the cost onto low-income people who are being punished. So people sometimes assume that this is happening because these services are being privatized, but no, it's not just private companies. Governments are forcing people to pay fees and fines all the time. It keeps them entrapped in the system. We see people paying $10 or $20 a day for their own monitors, in addition to installation fees, paying for their shackles. We see people now charge for their own probation. We see people paying fees while they're on sex offense registries, and in some cases, needing to pay several $1,000s to finally get off the registry. And so many of these reforms are bipartisan darlings, in part because they're marketed as cost saving, because we see this mentality of scarcity, and it's like, oh, what a great way to cut costs. But these cost saving measures are widening the net of control and surveillance. And what does cost saving really mean? Saving costs for whom? Certainly not the people who are being surveilled and policed and confined and killed. Certainly not, you know, people who are vastly disproportionately living in poverty and whose poverty is going to deepen as a result of their criminalization. So I think we need to push that question in relation to all these reforms when we talk about budgets. Like, who are we saving costs for? Especially when we hear these lines about how conservatives and progressives are all on the same page in terms of prisons, or, you know, it's a bipartisan issue because real conservatives want to spend less. Well, a few of them do want to spend less, but they don't want to then take those resources and then put them toward life-giving priorities. They want them to go back into the pockets of rich people, corporations, etc. So that can't be the same page. And I would recommend Kay Whitlock and Nancy Heitzig have a book coming up on this. I think this bipartisan alliance that has actually become quite dangerous. So right now, I love how abolitionist organizers leading the calls to defund police are not just saying defund, they're always including that component of what should be funded and prioritized instead, looking at those life-giving priorities. So this is not a conservative movement, it's a generative movement of abundance and a movement of care.
Yes, indeed. And I want to go back to what you had said earlier, Ruthie, that instead of thinking of a faster, surer punishment after a harm has happened, how we should be looking at asking ourselves what conditions minimize the chances of harm happening. And what we're seeing with budget activism is people saying we need to shift, you know, those resources from the police departments to transforming some of these conditions that keep harm from happening or can stop future harm from happening. At the same time, we also have been seeing politicians, left, right, center, glom onto these demands and play a shell game where basically in New York City, for example, we just saw the city council shift money for school policing out of the NYPD budget to the Department of Education, but it still kept the same police in the schools. So $427 million just becomes a line item from NYPD to DOE, but it's not that the Department of Education is now going to have more teachers. Instead, they still have their hiring freeze. The same police officers are, if schools reopen, the same police officers will show up come September and continue doing their functions, except their paychecks will come from DOE. In Atlanta, we saw calls to defund the police. We also saw calls to defund and close the Atlanta City Detention Center, which was built in the 1990s specifically to hide the homeless and other undesirables from public view when the Olympics were coming to Atlanta. So the people who were locked, and continues to this day. So there are 2 jails in the Atlanta area. The first one is the Fulton County Jail, which is where you go if you are arrested for, say, robbery or burglary or assault, and you are given a bail you can't afford or remanded without bail, you go there. And then there's the Atlanta City Detention Center, which is 17 stories and over 1,100 beds. This giant behemoth, it towers over everything in that neighborhood. And that is where you go for violations of city ordinances, like walking along a roadway. For people who have gone to Atlanta and walk around a lot, like I did this past winter, I don't drive, you will be walking and suddenly the sidewalk is not there anymore. And lo and behold, you are in the middle of a roadway. But this is something that police will arrest you for, and you can be sent to the Atlanta City Detention Center while they figure out what to do with you. Buying alcohol and drinking it near the store in which you bought it. Driving while intoxicated, driving without a license, driving with a suspended license. So this was what this giant behemoth jail is for. So there have been calls in recent years led by formerly incarcerated people who have been detained in that jail over the years to close this jail down, because there is no need to lock people up for these kinds of status offenses. It doesn't actually solve anybody's underlying issues. It doesn't provide sidewalks to the parts of Atlanta that don't have sidewalks. It doesn't provide a safe place for people to go and live or to go and drink their beer. You see beer gardens with, like outside seating areas, but in the poorer neighborhoods, you can be picked up and arrested if you drink a beer on the sidewalk outside the store. And instead, what the city council did was they, again, did what the New York City Council would later do, which is they took $13.5 million after hearing from over 1,000 constituents, and they shifted it from the Department of Correction to the Mayor's Office of Constituent Services. But I listened to numerous hours of City Council online hearings, and basically what they said was, these same officers are going to report to the jail July 1st, except now their paycheck comes from the Office of Constituent Services. So the jail did not close. These officers were not reassigned. There's some talk about figuring out where to reassign people, but they have not been told, you know what, you 25 nurses that usually do DOC things, we need nurses now for people suffering from COVID. Why don't we reassign you to the hospitals? You are no longer part of this jail complex anymore. Go be a nurse in a clinic, because the nurses here are overworked, overwhelmed, and they need more help. You 50, technicians that, your skills are transferable to do these other things that the city of Atlanta needs right now. But no, instead they continue to go to jail. So they continue to report to the jail. So we see that there's budget activism, and there are ways in which the state co-opts this kind of budget activism in a way that doesn't actually address any of these underlying needs and does not change conditions so that harm doesn't happen or does not continue to happen. And then, Ruthie, you had talked about the work of Insight, and Insight starting 20 years ago, and acknowledging and recognizing the reality that police don't stop domestic violence, they increase the chances of violence. And in our book, we've interviewed domestic violence survivors who have been punished by the system, and not necessarily always the criminal legal system, but other systems that were supposed to help them. We interviewed one domestic violence survivor who actually went to a domestic violence shelter or domestic violence service organization because she was experiencing abuse at home. And she was the mother of, I think it was, she had 5 children, one of which was an adult, 4 of which were minor children. So they were younger children. And this domestic violence organization said, well, we can find a safe place for you and 2 of your children. But they could not find a safe place for her and 4 of her children. So what was she going to do? Leave her abusive spouse and leave 2 children in that household and hope that they would be okay? How was she going to pick which 2 children she was going to bring with her out of that household and which 2 she was going to leave in? So she decided instead she was going to try to figure out another option. She stayed, so therefore she could be there and try to minimize the amount of harm that happened to her children because she was there. But because this domestic violence service organization was a mandated reporter, they called child welfare on her. And child welfare showed up at her door and said, because you are in this violent, abusive household, you are endangering your children and you need to go and get safe. So we're going to take your children away from you and put them in the foster care system until you get safe. And they didn't tell her, this is where you can go to get safe. They didn't provide her with a housing voucher or any sort of resources to go get safe. They just said, go get safe. So she was left without her children, fighting to get her children back. When we interviewed her, she was living in a homeless shelter and going through myriad programs. And none of this actually stopped the violence. Like, it didn't enable her to get out of the relationship safely. Basically, it foisted on her, the punishment of taking away her children, the threat of not getting them back. And they took away her children. They didn't take her away, as well. They didn't say, like, we have found you an apartment in a place where your abusive partner cannot find you, and we will move you all here. Instead, they said, nope, we're going to just take you away, take your children away. And I think relying on policing invisibilizes the ways in which decades of organized abandonment, whittle down to affect her choices, where it's, if you are a low-income person with 4 children, where are you going to go if you need to suddenly get safe? What are your options? Oh, you don't have very many options. Well, here is the policing stick. And in this case, the policing looks like social workers rather than people with badges and guns. But had she, say, put up a fight against having her children taken away, I'm sure they would have called in the people with the badges and the guns. So, but also at this moment, as we're tumbling towards our full-scale economic depression, we also have to remember that this moment has also given us ways in which we've also started to build community and deepen mutual aid. So we're seeing in different neighborhoods, people getting to know their neighbors, people forming mutual aid organizations. And Ajiris Dixon, who is one of the co-creators of the Safe Neighborhoods campaign at the Audre Lorde Project, whom we interviewed, also reminded us that, we practice abolition and safety every day. We often find ways to get people to safety without calling the police, without relying on prisons. People may not call it that, they just know that they helped somebody out of a situation and maybe got them safe, whether temporarily or more long-term. And we don't necessarily always call it that. So I think that also when we think about abolition and building the world we want to see, we don't think of it as this thing that we have to learn a lot about, but we can do and go as we build that world.
I was thinking about what the 2 of you were just discussing, and a couple of things I'd like to lift up for our discussion now. I noticed that in the comments, people are saying, this is by design, this is by design. Hey, everybody, we know it. We've been talking about it since the beginning of the event. So emphasizing this is by design is a good thing to do, but please understand that if there's one thing abolitionists should understand, at the outset is that things are by design. So how do we understand the design in order to undo them? And I think I want to echo what people have said about Ageris Dixon. When I first learned about the project that Ageris and comrades put into action in the neighborhood, it just completely blew my mind, because it wasn't based in households. It wasn't between friends. It was rather how they so thoughtfully studied the environment in which they were trying to get along and have lives that would not be harmed by hostile anybody. And they started to notice, because of what they were trying to achieve, and Ageris, if you're listening and I'm wrong, tell me, but they started to notice who, completely different, might have some sense of identification with them. So a small shop owner who's in their shop all the time is somebody to make common cause with. We bring our business to your shop. It's not an exchange like a capitalist transaction, it's mutual aid. And we should understand this as mutual aid. And if we're in trouble, we can come in your shop and we know you won't throw us out. That's just one example of many. And it gives us some understanding of how it is that what seems to be so fixed and intractable actually is changing all the time based on what people do. Another point I want to raise is, I want to come back to the question about budgets and budget activism, and to underscore what Maya said and what Vicky said from the abolitionist perspective, and I'm being bold and saying the abolitionist, not an abolitionist perspective, and that is, we're not about saving money, ever, 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 ever. I mean, the guys in Washington, DC turn on their copy machine and print money. That's what they do. It is the default reserve currency of the entire planet. The US can't run out of money, it just makes it, and it makes it, and it makes it. And what happened in March was the US turned on the Xerox machine and printed $2 trillion, a small amount of which came to households, workers, and communities, and the rest went into the hands of large corporations and finance capital corporations to be allocated and allegedly trickle down into households. Anybody's household seen any of that dough? Of course you haven't. Of course you haven't. So given that it is possible, not only for the federal government, but for other governments to basically turn on a machine and print money, the question is, how do we force that to happen? And how do we force it to happen so the money comes to our pockets? How do we demand, including all of being in the streets, that the unemployment compensation that disappears at the end of this month extends? How do we demand that the decline in the number of hospital beds in the United States, which is breathtaking, from the middle of the 1980s until now, breathtaking, begins to come up again? How can it be that in rural communities, for example, that have had district hospitals that were established mostly during the Depression to serve the needs of rural workers and their households, however unequally, but they were there. The building was there, the technology was there, the trained people were there, and that people, Black people, Indigenous people, various people who had been kept out, fought their way in. Those hospitals are gone, and communities desperate to have local health care look to what? To bring the possibility in their direction. They look to prisons and jails. because their view is, not mistakenly, if there's a prison or a jail, there will be healthcare people nearby, as Vicki was describing in the Atlanta urban context, and those healthcare people might actually run a clinic that non-prison people can use. I ran into this so many times doing rural work around the United States. So these are the kinds of general social welfare provisions that we must demand. We must demand. Schools. Well, let me interrupt myself and say something else before I go on to schools. And this is about budgets. In the 1990s, when I was a graduate student at Rutgers, I was in my 40s, and I'd gone back to school to do a PhD. And I'd roll into Manhattan to learn things and meet people and find out what was going on. I happened to meet the late great Eddie Ellis. And Eddie Ellis, who was very well known in New York, anti-prison, had been an Attica brother, Attica survivor, did many, many things around New York. Somebody I didn't always agree with, but somebody I could always work with. He was a comrade. We had productive disagreements. Eddie, in the 90s, was part of New York Prison Moratorium Project with a union organizer off and on called Kevin Pranis, who lives in Minneapolis and has for many years. Eddie gave a talk one afternoon in which he said that what he and Prison Moratorium Project in New York were doing was going around to communities throughout New York State and asking community-based organizations of whatever size and scope, including unions, as well as more, grassrootsy formations. What do you need in terms of money resources to do more of what you already do? And his idea that he shared with us in an afternoon in New York was, we should organize eventually to realize a general strike. And the demand would be that all the resources going into prisons and policing would go to these life-affirming organizations, because all of the people who already know what to do and how to do it will be prepared to do more of what they do. Craig Gilmore and I said, that's the thing we need to do. So when we got to California, along with some comrades there, we started the California Prison Moratorium Project. That was the purpose of that project. We never got to the general strike, but we did get really deep into the kind of budget activism that we've been talking about this afternoon. Not in terms of ever saving a dime for anybody, but rather in saying, as Maya pointed out and Vicki underscored, that a budget is a statement of priority. It's a worldview. And so we fight and fight and fight for the worldview that we want.
Thank you. So we spend a lot of our book talking about all the dangerous reforms that have cropped up. We've talked about some of them this afternoon, and we talk about why they're so bad. But in our last chapter, we explore projects and visions for what a real transformation could actually be. And Ruthie, when we interviewed you, you pointed out, and this is one of my favorite quotes, that we need to talk about abolition, not as an aspirational adventure, but as a growing body of already accumulated encounters and awarenesses and activities. So we wanted to make our last question before we open it up to Q&A, a discussion of what a liberated society could actually look like.
My turn? Am I
Yes.
supposed to answer this? Okay. What would it look like? Well, let me sneak up on that by talking about some of the already organized people that I've had the pleasure and challenge to organize with over time. So I will give you, or the example is social workers. Now, a number of people put in the chat, and rightly so, but social workers are, as Vicki pointed out, more and more constrained by being part of the forces of organized violence. That doesn't mean that's what they train to do, nor does it mean it's what they want to do, even if it's what they have to do. So I've spent time talking with organizations of social workers who don't take more than 10 minutes to understand what abolition is all about. So while there are plenty of not abolitionist social worker individuals, of that I have no doubt, and while not abolitionist policies and rules define and contour what social work is, it doesn't have to be that way, because the skills that so many people acquired and practice to become social workers can be something else. My sister-in-law just retired after being a social worker for almost 50 years. And as I said, I've talked to roomfuls of social workers. Nurses is another example of the transferable skill. The transferable skill that even with nursing has been spoiled by the capture of medical interventions by the prison industrial complex and policing. So there have been, for example, people who have done common cause organizing with emergency care room medical professionals to persuade them not to call the police in all of those instances in which they have been until recently required to call the police. You know how to fix somebody, fix them. You don't need any cops in the room to fix them, fix them. And so there's been a rising consciousness on the part of doctors, nurses, and others about what could be possible, you know, in the context of emergency rooms. School teachers. School teachers became teachers to teach. I don't know a single teacher who became a teacher to have summers off. Being a teacher is really hard. It's exhausting and it's wonderful. And people become teachers to teach. However, many teachers have been worn down over time because of all of the ways that, one, public education has been starved of resources, starved and starved and starved of resources, and undermined by charter schools and so forth. And on the other hand, again, the assignment of policing functions to teachers, the constant assignment of policing functions to teachers. So when I see, for example, as happened in Chicago last year, the great strike and the kinds of demands that the Chicago Teachers Union was making, I saw abolition there, whether or not they, in their central committee and their policy platform says, now we're abolitionists. That didn't matter to me, what they called themselves. What mattered to me was what they said they were doing. And what I saw was abolition. The same with the teachers in West Virginia, the teachers in Oklahoma, the teachers in Los Angeles. All of these teachers who are insisting that the schools become, again, the places that they train to become teachers to work in, that they become life-affirming and cultivating environments for children who should be able to go to school, who should not be hungry, all of those things. Glenn Ford, who was one of the founders of Black Agenda Report, which everybody should read if they don't, Glenn Ford told a story not that long ago about how when he started I can't remember the name of it now, but the magazine that he founded and ran before he started Black Agenda Report. He said, at the beginning of the 2000s, my friends and I put together a journal that was deliberately for the Black left. And this journal was designed to raise questions that the Black left should grapple with, and to show, if we could, because we were journalists, perhaps some issues that the Black left was not entirely cognizant of, not aware of, not doing things about. So they wrote their first articles, and he said, but what we didn't have for our first issue was the big headline, big lead article that would bring everything together. We just didn't know what to do. And it turned out it was staring us in the face. And what it was this. The Manhattan Institute, that right-wing think tank that brought us Heather McDonald and all of those people, and another of the right-wing think tanks had been working very hard over a very long time to undermine the credibility of organized labor everywhere. And they had put a particular focus on teachers because of the high rate of participation in organized labor in the Black community. That teaching has been a path to a stable middle income life for many Black people. My next older brother is a retired teacher. I mean, I've got one of every category in my family, so I can lay this all out. So the problem that the Manhattan Institute was trying to figure out how to address was, how can we turn the Black community, which is to say particularly urban Black voters, against teachers' unions so that we can finally undo the hold that public education has on education in urban areas. And so they thought and thought and thought, and finally they had Cory Booker come and be their special guest at some special meeting in, I think it was in Florida, and saw a way to lift up the notion of vouchers and charter education to give to households in Black communities in urban America what would appear to be the resolution to the frustration they had. And that frustration was, our schools are getting worse and worse and worse. So instead of blaming the decline of the schools on the withdrawal of resources for the well-being of schools, for physical plant, for equipment and books and so forth, they figured out that if they turned the light brightly on the teachers' union instead of on the municipalities and the districts that fund or defund the school, then they could drive a wedge between the union and Black voters by dangling vouchers and undermine one of the last strongholds of large-scale organized Black political life in the United States. That's what they did. So we see from that example how important it is not for us to defend any union anytime, but for us to take seriously the importance of organizing within organized labor to bring it back to the promise of organized labor, not to say whoever is in charge is fine. So I've mentioned nurses. Angela Davis and I will be speaking to the California Nurses Association in September. I've mentioned social workers, I've mentioned teachers. There are so many other people to talk with. And one of the questions that we can address in a number of ways is this. Because organized labor has had such a hard time over the last now almost 50 years in maintaining membership, much less growing membership, many, many, many labor unions have branched out in terms of what kinds of workers they organize. So we know Teamsters organize graduate students, and UAW auto workers organize graduate students. The AFT has organized locals of police in it, the American Federation of Teachers, and so on and so forth. So we've got this whole melange. And so what we can do is look at the labor movement and lift up those aspects of the labor movement that are actually doing life-affirming work and drive a wedge of our own between those and those aspects of the labor movement, excuse me, that are only established to promote the work of organized violence. And I'll say one last thing, because somebody who's listening to this is going to say, but there are lots of Black cops, Gilmore, and brown cops, and white women cops, and indigenous cops, and what about them and their households? I never said I don't want them to have income. I said I don't want them to be police. And I know of police officers who had a change in consciousness, who are trying to become nurses and trying to become something else. They've stepped away from the organized part of organized violence to transform themselves. And that can't be done within police departments or within those policing unions, even if individuals can make the transition. And if there's one thing abolitionists know, is that people change. People change. And that is not the same as making some bipartisan coalition agreement. It's really about consciousness.
Thank you so much for laying that all out and giving us all so much to think about. When we're talking about or thinking about what a liberated society actually looks like, you talked about looking at the people who are doing this work already, and people are doing work that is abolitionist. Sometimes it's not called abolition, as you mentioned, like it could be these efforts. And then I also want to highlight some of the initiatives and projects that we did find as we were researching and reporting on our book, and some of the people that we'd interviewed. I mentioned earlier, and you talked also about Ajiris Dixon and the Safe Neighborhoods campaign in Central Brooklyn, where businesses and storefronts took part in promoting community safety, specifically for queer and trans people in the community, queer and trans people of color who knew that they were not safe with the police. If you call the police in, they are a source of violence, but often experience violence from other people, in the homophobic and transphobic violence from people in the community. And so what does safety look like? How can everyday people participate in safety? Rachel Herzing, another co-founder of Critical Resistance, started the Build the Block initiative in Oakland, where people get to know their neighbors and figure out what kind of skills they might have. So again, like not just something bad happened, let me call the police, but what are the, like something happened, what needs to happen to address the harm, or what needs to happen to keep the harm from escalating? And I think one of the things that we're seeing with this pandemic in some places is that people are getting to know their neighbors. We're starting to build those networks and relationships, whereas in the past, everybody, especially in a place like New York City, just ran around, to their job, to their home, to their this, to their that, and we're not necessarily making those relationships because we're all just in our own little bubbles. But now it means that like longer term residents are getting to know other people who might not have been there as long. People are developing mutual aid projects to get to know each other. And when you do that, you have a relationship in which then you can address things, and it doesn't have to be big things. Like, we don't start with the most volatile situation, but it can be smaller things like, I noticed that you bounce your basketball above my bed. Can you please not do that? Can you please, like we're all sheltered at home. Please don't bounce your basketball above my bed. Or please, don't blast your music after a certain hour. And people are accountable to people that they have relationships more than they are to total strangers. So that is one example of something that has been concretized as the Build the Block initiative, but it's something that we can all do in our everyday lives. You know, do you know who your neighbors are? Do you say hello to them? You don't have to like your neighbors. You don't have to invite them over for dinner. But, you know, but do you know who they are? Do they know who you are? You know, like, who are the neighbors that you can call if you're having a problem? You know, who are the neighbors that you cannot rely on, so don't bother asking them for help, because you know that they're going to just say no. But it's important, if we're thinking about community safety, to have these kinds of plans. The Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, started by Mia Mingus, who also was a co-founder of Generation 5, which worked to end child sexual abuse, talks about creating pods. And we hear now more about pods because people talk about pods as, like, you know, how to move around more safely during coronavirus. But pods are basically like, what are your relationships? And what do those relationships look like? You know, so if you have, if you think about your relationships with people, who can you call when you need $5, $10, $20 because you need to take a, you know, a taxi to the hospital? Who is the person that might help you out if you are short on groceries? Who is the person that you need to help you out if you are experiencing a crisis? So, like, what are your relationships, and what are the types of supports they can offer, and what can you offer to them? You know, somebody might say, I can offer babysitting, but otherwise I don't have a pot to piss in. I cannot give you $20. You know, as much scrounging in my couch cushion as I do, you know, there's no $20 coming out of there. And then we see other, you know, initiatives, like Maya and I did an interview with a woman who had been a student, I think, in Champaign-Urbana, who was part of a group called Crisis Nursery when she was there. And she didn't realize that there was not a similar initiative in every city, but a crisis nursery was basically if somebody needed emergency childcare, you know, whether it's because, say, they were, you know, like going to court, going to some, you know, a job interview, if they just thought that they were going to lose their mind, you know, because of the demands of parenting, and just needed a safe place for their child to go, you know, if they were going to have surgery, whatever the case may be, it was a nursery that offered round the clock childcare. So if at 3 a.m. you're just like, this baby will not stop crying, you know, and I'm going to lose my mind and I need that hour respite, you could go there and, you know, like, have that hour respite. Like, what would it look like if we thought of ways that are life affirming? And I bring this up too because we have not been interrupted by Maya's toddler, but, you know, Maya at some point might want to say, I would like to have 10 minutes to myself when I am not working, when I am not preparing for, you know, our never-ending virtual book tour, when I am not, you know, being asked for a muffin or a cookie or a hug. You know, I just want to sit and be quiet, you know. And wouldn't it be great if there were places where people could go, so that before we get to a boiling point where somebody is like, I am so stressed, my landlord raised my rent, my boss tells me that my hours are getting reduced, you know, the subway, you know, like, I'm afraid to take the subway, and my toddler won't stop crying, you know. It's like, maybe you cannot control the, like, in the immediate term, the rent raising, the laying off of hours, the subway being a COVID mess. But if you had a place that you could bring your child to and say, okay, here is, you know, harm prevention right here. Like, instead of this individualized way that capitalism works, which is, you know, if I'm about to lose my mind, too bad, I'm a bad parent. And if I go off and I start yelling at my kid, somebody will call child welfare, and child welfare will come, and they won't say, why are you yelling? Oh, it's because your rent is going up and your hours are going down and you're afraid to ride the subway, you know, to your job. So you're taking, you know, like, expensive taxis every day. And now your kid just broke something expensive, the refrigerator, and you need to replace that. And so you have just lost your mind and you're yelling. You're going to say, you're a bad parent. We're taking away your child because you don't have a working refrigerator and you are yelling and all these other things. They're not going to say, how can we help you with this? So, you know, like, so thinking of the life affirming things that we can do, And then also recognizing that there are also everyday abolitionist things that we can do for each other.
Absolutely. I want to be conscious of the fact that we have 10 minutes and we also should address some questions. So I mean, I think the alternatives and the programs that you outlined, Vicki, are just really core ones for the last chapter of our book, and like give kind of a sample of things that people can try, right? Because none of these are blueprints that you then manufacture in a mass way, and that's the answer to what you do instead of prison. I think that one of the things that we're trying to get at is that there isn't one monolithic institution that is going to come in and replace prison. Like, that's going to be oppressive, you know? So we look at all of these different things that people can do to respond to harm, to prevent harm, to create different conditions in society so that harm is not occurring in the first place. And also, like, you know, shaking up our priorities in the ways that we have been talking about this whole time, so that we're not just seeing the need, like people's basic needs, as the one thing that needs to happen, which I think, of course, that's important. But we've also been talking about the need for leisure, the need for time, the need for people to be able to have some joy in their lives, like all of these things too. I think we have to remember to consider. We only have a few minutes left, but I think one of the things that we try to do in our book is bring in a disability justice framework. And especially since so much of the prison industrial complex right now and the discussion of alternatives is wrapped up with this idea of mental illness. Like, everyone in prison is diagnosed with mental illness or whatever, you know, quite a few people. And the thing about that, I think, that we need to keep in mind is, A, people are diagnosed with mental illness because they're exhibiting symptoms and behaviors that get categorized as mental illness. And of course, people in prison are being traumatized, so we have to be conscious of that. But we also need to think about, okay, how are we creating conditions in society in which those kinds of traumas are less likely to happen, not only because of institutions, but more broadly? And also, how can we shift to start to not approach people's experiences and thoughts and like ways of life that might be different in the ways that are currently categorized and diagnosed as mental illness, but like how can we come to approach those in ways that are capacious, that make room for them? I think this gets back to a lot of what we've been talking about, how society needs to change, as opposed to kind of putting the burden on individuals to not only kind of get in line, but also to normalize. And there's a lot more to discuss about that, but I just want to make sure to throw it into the mix. I think we have time for a couple of questions. One that I think we haven't discussed yet is, what is the role of surveillance and data gathering and forecasting systems in the prison industrial complex? And what have been some successful and ongoing campaigns or actions to oppose the expansion of those information systems? So just in terms of the role of surveillance and data gathering, it's expansive, right? One of the things that we talk about in our book is the way in which data, and also just the idea of data, has been used by the police to kind of legitimize the police. So data is trotted out at these community policing meetings, and it's kind of, there's an element of showmanship, as we discuss in our book, around that. But also it's being used to monitor and surveil like more and more and more aspects of people's lives. So we see this with electronic monitoring. We also see it with predictive policing. So this is something that is a word that means a lot of different things. But one of the things we talk about in our book is that predictive policing is often based on history, right? It's based on who has been arrested in a particular area in the past, and then deploying more and more police to those areas. And of course, places where people have been arrested in the past have been places that have been targeted in the past. And those are usually Black communities, other communities of color, low-income communities. So predictive policing and this kind of data-driven policing is often elevated as an alternative, elevated as a reform that can kind of move us beyond policing by humans, but really it's reproducing more and more of the same thing. So that's one example. I don't know if, Vicky, if you want to pick that up or whether we should transition to announcements.
We have 5 minutes left.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, I know.
How does this recur?
Flown by. The time has flown
I feel like
by.
we have 20,000 more things.
But Ruthie, as our special invited person from all the way across the pond, do you have any final thoughts very quickly before I do our wrap up?
Sure. I want to thank you again for asking me to participate in this launch. I want to thank everybody who came and who offered questions, and I scanned some of them and tried to deal with some of the questions in my comments. And here's what I want to leave you with. To achieve abolition, we only have to change one thing, which is everything. And that means not, we have to change everything at once, that somehow it's a destroy everything, scorch the earth, salt the land, and start again. No, whatever it is, you can do what appeals to you, what bothers you, whatever that is, go do it. And some people are saying, oh, but it's so overwhelming. All of these institutions have internalized policing. Yes, they have. Yes, they have. I mean, the first revolt against unfreedom in that side of the Atlantic happened on Christmas Day in 1521 on the island that became Haiti. And it took 300 years, but they got that revolution done. Now, it shouldn't take us 300 years, but don't think there isn't anything magic. It's just doing it. Rehearse it. Rehearse it. Rehearse the revolution. Do it. Do it again. Do it again. Instead of saying but, say and do it again and do it again. That's how we get there. And that's the only way we get there, whether you're in a union, in a grassroots community, in a building, whatever you do. There are examples from around the world. Take them seriously. And do not believe for 1 second these people who say, we will fly to Scandinavia, study their prisons, bring their prisons back and drop them into the United States where there is no other social welfare, and they're going to be great, because they won't. They'll be prisons. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruthie, for joining us. We are so honored. Thank you to Bluestockings for hosting our book launch. We're really, really thrilled that we could at least virtually be here. Hopefully at some point we can all be together in the bookstore as well. Thank you too to our co-sponsors for co-sponsoring this event, Books Through Bars New York City, which sends free books to people in prison, Critical Resistance New York City, which has been working towards abolition in our city, The Independent, which is independent media. They have a physical newspaper. If you're in New York City, look for the red Independent box. They also have an online presence. They also published one of the first reviews of our book way back during the pandemic, so it's only online. And Survived and Punished New York, which supports criminalized and incarcerated survivors of gendered violence. Thank you also to our ASL interpreters, Brandon Kazin-Maddox, who is signing for us right now, and Crystal Butler, who has been switching off with Brandon. and to our live captioner, Renata Reed, and all county captions. So thank you so much for making this event accessible. And thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that you did not get to see the guest appearance by the cat or the toddler, but better luck next time.
Next time. That'll be the next bookstore appearance we do.
Yes.
At Women and Children First on August 19th, except really here on the internet.
Yes. Oh, and Maya and I will be joined by Ajiris Dixon and Devontae Tate on Monday, July 27th at the Brooklyn Historical Society, if you want to know more about the Safe Neighborhoods campaign and building safety in community without police. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.